In the summer of 1952, the small town of Millbrook, Montana, watched as 19-year-old Clara Bennett walked down the aisle toward a man she'd met only twice. Her hands trembled as they clutched a small bouquet of wildflowers, not from joy, but from fear and uncertainty. The groom, 42-year-old rancher Thomas Whitmore, stood at the altar, waiting with an unreadable expression etched on his weathered face. Everyone in the packed church whispered that it was a transaction, not a marriage. A business deal dressed up in white lace and empty vows. The town had already written Clara's story, a tragic tale of a young woman sold into a loveless marriage to pay her dead father's debts. But what happened at the reception that followed would leave the entire town speechless, challenge everything. They thought they knew about Thomas Whitmore and change Clara's life in ways no one could have imagined. Clara Bennett had always been the brightest star in Millbrook. With chestnut hair that caught the sunlight like copper wire and eyes the color of summer sky, she turned heads wherever she went. But it wasn't just her beauty that made her special. It was her mind, her spirit, her dreams that stretched far beyond the dusty streets of their small Montana town. She'd been valedictorian of her high school class. She spent her free time at the town library, devouring every book she could find. She volunteered at the elementary school, helping children learn to read, and everyone said she was born to be a teacher. Clara had dreams bigger than the Montana sky. She wanted to attend college in the fall, to get her teaching degree, to see the world beyond the mountains that hemmed in their little town. She wanted to escape the poverty that had defined every day of her childhood. Her mother, Elizabeth, had been a gentle woman who worked as a seamstress. Her fingers always moving, always creating beauty from scraps. She'd encouraged Clara's dreams, saved every penny she could in a coffee tin hidden in the kitchen. "You're going to do great things," she'd whisper to Clara at night. "You're going to have the life I never could." But fate, as it often does, had other plans. Clara's father, Robert Bennett, had always been a weak man, a dreamer without the discipline to make dreams reality. He worked sporadically at the lumber mill, but his real passion was gambling, poker, games in back rooms, bets on horse races, dice games that lasted until dawn. When Clara's mother was alive, Elizabeth had managed to keep him somewhat in check, hiding money, pleading with him to think of their daughter's future. But when Elizabeth died of pneumonia, the winter Clara turned 16, Robert lost the only anchor he'd ever had. His gambling spiraled out of control. He borrowed from friends, then acquaintances, then anyone who would lend to him. He made promises he couldn't keep, took loans he couldn't repay. Clara watched helplessly as their small house, the house her mother had made into a home, began to fill with the shadow of debt. Creditors came to the door. Her father would disappear for days, then return smelling of whiskey and desperation. Clara took a job at Rosie's diner, working after school and on weekends, trying to keep food on the table and the electricity on. By the time Clara turned 19, her father owed money to half the town. The largest debt, $5,000, a fortune in those days, was owed to Thomas Whitmore, who'd loaned Robert the money for what was supposed to be a business investment that never materialized. Then, on a cold morning in April, Clara found her father slumped in his chair, a victim of a massive heart attack. The doctor said it was quick, that he didn't suffer. But Clara knew the truth. Her father had been suffering for years, drowning in debts and regrets. At his funeral, attended by only a handful of people, Clara stood alone at the graveside and realized the terrible truth: she'd inherited nothing but his debts. The creditors were already circling like vultures. She worked double shifts at the diner, her college fund long gone, her hands raw from washing dishes and carrying heavy trays. But it wasn't enough. It would never be enough. She was about to lose everything: the house, her mother's belongings, every memory of the life they'd once had. Thomas Whitmore appeared at her door on a Tuesday evening in June, just as the sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Clara had seen him around town, of course. Everyone knew Thomas Whitmore. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered from years of ranch work, with silver threading through his dark hair and lines around his eyes from squinting into the sun. His ranch, the Whitmore Spread, was the largest in the county, sprawling across thousands of acres of prime grazing land. He'd been widowed for 15 years, people said. His wife had died in childbirth, and though the baby, a son, survived, the boy had grown up and died in Korea, just 20 years old, cut down by enemy fire before he'd really lived. Thomas had been alone ever since, running his ranch with the help of a few hired hands, living in that big house with only ghosts for company. "Miss Bennett," he said, standing on her porch with his hat in his hands, looking uncomfortable. "I hope I'm not intruding. Might I have a word?" Clara invited him in, her heart already sinking because she knew what was coming. He was here about the debt, about the $5,000 her father had borrowed and never repaid. They sat in her small living room, and Thomas looked around at the worn furniture, the photographs, on the walls, the careful way Clara had tried to maintain dignity in the face of poverty. "Miss Bennett, Clara, I'm going to be direct because I'm not a man who knows how to be otherwise," he began. "I know about your situation. I know about the debts. I know the bank is going to foreclose on this house in 30 days. Clara felt tears prick her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. "I'm working as much as I can, Mr. Whitmore. I'll pay you back, I promise. It might take years, but I'll—" He held up a hand. "I'm not here to collect, Clara. I'm here with a proposition, a solution, if you will." And then he said it, the words that would change everything. "Marry me, and I'll forgive your father's debt. I'll pay off all the other creditors too, every penny owed. You'll have security, a home, and you'll never want for anything material again." The room seemed to spin. Clara gripped the arm of her chair. I don't understand. Why would you—" "I'm lonely," Thomas said simply. "I've been alone in that big house for 15 years. I'm 42 years old, and I wake up every morning to silence. I eat my meals alone. I go to bed alone. I'm not asking for love, Clara. I'm not expecting passion or romance, just partnership, companionship, someone to share the burden of days with." "And what about what I want?" Clara asked, her voice barely a whisper. "I had plans, college, a career, a life." Thomas nodded slowly. "I know, and I'm asking you to give that up. I won't pretend otherwise. It's not fair, and it's not right, but life rarely is either of those things." He stood to leave, placing his hat back on his head. "You have 3 days to decide, Clara. I won't pressure you, and I won't hold it against you if you say no, but the offer stands. Think about it." Clara didn't sleep for those 3 days. She walked through her house, touching her mother's things, the quilt on the bed, the china in the cabinet, the books on the shelf. She looked at the acceptance letter from Montana State College, now just a painful reminder of dreams that were slipping away. She thought about her options. She could refuse Thomas and lose everything, start over with nothing in a new town where no one knew her or her father's shame. She could accept and trade her freedom for security. There were no good choices, only different kinds of sacrifice. On the 3rd day, she looked at her mother's photograph on the mantel, Elizabeth, in her wedding dress, young and hopeful, and she made her choice. She would marry Thomas Whitmore. The wedding was held at Millbrook's only church on a Saturday morning in late June. The whole town came, not to celebrate, but to witness what they saw as a tragedy unfolding. Young, beautiful Clara Bennett, with her whole life ahead of her, being sold off to the lonely old rancher to pay her dead father's debts. The whispers started before Clara even arrived. "Poor girl, sacrificing herself like that. It's like something from a Victorian novel. He's buying himself a wife, plain and simple. It's shameful, even if it is legal. She'll be miserable out on that ranch, miles from town, with a man old enough to be her father. Mark my words. I heard he's cold as ice, never smiles. That house will be like a prison for her." Clara arrived in a borrowed car, driven by Mrs. Henderson from the diner. She wore her mother's wedding dress, carefully altered to fit her smaller frame, the lace yellowed with age but still beautiful. Her hands shook as she held a small bouquet of wildflowers that Mrs. Henderson had picked that morning. As she walked down the aisle, she felt every eye on her, felt the weight of their pity and judgment. Thomas stood at the altar in a simple black suit, his face stoic and unreadable. When she reached him, he offered his arm, and she noticed something that surprised her. His hand was shaking too. He was nervous, maybe even afraid. The ceremony was brief. Reverend Matthews spoke about commitment and partnership, carefully avoiding words like love and devotion. When he pronounced them husband and wife, Thomas didn't kiss her, just nodded respectfully and squeezed her hand once, gently. Then they walked together, arm in arm, to the church hall for the reception. The reception was painfully awkward. Long tables were set up with simple food, sandwiches, potato salad, a modest two-tier cake that Mrs. Henderson had baked. People ate and made polite conversation, but the atmosphere was heavy with pity and judgment. It felt more like a wake than a wedding. Clara sat at the head table, feeling like an exhibit in a museum, something to be observed and discussed. Thomas sat beside her, barely touching his food. They didn't speak to each other. What was there to say? People came by to offer congratulations that felt hollow. Best wishes, dear. I hope you'll be very happy. The words were right, but the tone was all wrong. It was pity dressed up as politeness. Clara wanted to run. She wanted to tear off the wedding dress and flee into the mountains and never come back. But she sat there, frozen, playing the role she'd agreed to play. Then Thomas stood up. He picked up a spoon and tapped it against his glass, and the room fell silent. Every eye turned to him. I know what you all think, he began, his deep voice carrying across the hall. I can see it in your faces, hear it in your whispers. You think I've taken advantage of this young woman. You think this is a business arrangement, nothing more. You think I'm a lonely old man who bought himself a bride. Clara's cheeks burned with humiliation. She wanted to disappear, to sink through the floor. Why was he doing this? Why was he making it worse? You're partly right, Thomas continued, his voice steady. This marriage did begin as a solution to a problem. I won't lie about that. But I want to make something very clear to all of you, and especially to Clara. He reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope. Then another and another. He placed them on the table in front of Clara, a small stack of white envelopes. That seemed to glow in the afternoon light streaming through the windows. Clara, these are for you. Open them. With trembling hands, Clara picked up the first envelope. Inside was a legal document, the deed to her father's house, but it had been changed. Her name was on it now, Clara Whitmore. The house was hers, free and clear, in her name alone. She looked up at Thomas, confused, but he just nodded toward the other envelopes. The second envelope contained a bank book. She opened it with shaking fingers and gasped audibly. There was $10,000 deposited in an account at Millbrook Savings and Loan, under her name only. $10,000, more money than she'd ever imagined having. The room was completely silent now. Everyone was leaning forward, trying to see what was happening. The third envelope held a letter of acceptance from Montana State College. Her acceptance letter, the one she'd thought was just a painful memory. But there was more. Clipped to it was a check made out to the college, covering 4 years of tuition, room and board. Everything, her entire education, paid for. Tears streamed down Clara's face. She couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. Thomas continued, and his voice was softer now, almost gentle. Clara, I'm not a romantic man. I never have been. I don't have pretty words or grand gestures, but I want you to know something, and I want everyone here to witness it. He turned to face her fully, and she saw something in his eyes she hadn't expected. Kindness. Deep, genuine kindness. This marriage doesn't have to be a cage. That house, your mother's house, is yours. If you want to live there instead of at the ranch, that's your choice, and I'll respect it. That money is yours. If you want to leave tomorrow, if you want to, start over somewhere else, you can. I won't stop you. That education is yours. If you want to go to college, to become the teacher you've always dreamed of being, I'll drive you there myself and pick you up every weekend if you want to come visit. Clara couldn't stop crying. The tears flowed freely now, and she didn't care who saw. I asked you to marry me because I was lonely, yes, that's true. But also because I saw a bright young woman about to have her future stolen by circumstances beyond her control. I saw someone drowning, and I had the means to throw a rope. My son, my boy James, he would have been about your age now. He had dreams too, big dreams. He wanted to be a veterinarian, wanted to help animals. I couldn't save him. I couldn't bring him home from that war. But maybe I could help you. Maybe I could give you the chance he never got." He turned to face the crowd, and there was something fierce in his expression now. "So judge me if you want. Call me a fool for giving my new wife the means to leave me. Call me crazy for handing over money and property with no guarantee of anything in return. But I'd rather be a fool who did the right thing than a man who trapped someone in a gilded cage. I'd rather be alone again than know I'd stolen someone's future for my own comfort." He sat down heavily, as if the speech had taken everything out of him. For a long moment, no one moved. No one spoke. The silence was absolute. Then Clara stood. She looked at this man, this stranger who had just given her back her freedom, her future, her dreams, and she did something that surprised everyone in that room, including herself. She took his face in her hands and kissed him. Not on the cheek, but on the lips. A real kiss. Brief, but real. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Thank you for seeing me. Thank you for giving me a choice." The room erupted, not in whispers this time, but in applause. People stood, clapping, some wiping away tears of their own. The town of Millbrook had come to witness a tragedy, but they'd witnessed something else entirely, an act of profound, selfless kindness. The town's attitude shifted that day. What they'd witnessed wasn't a transaction. It was something rare and precious. Thomas Whitmore, the lonely rancher they'd all pitied and judged, had revealed himself to be a man of extraordinary character. But the biggest surprise was Clara's decision. She didn't leave. She didn't move back to her father's house. She didn't take the money and run. Instead, she chose to stay at the ranch and get to know her husband. "You gave me the freedom to choose," she told him that night, as they sat on the wide porch of his ranch house, watching the stars come out over the mountains. "So I'm choosing to stay, not because I have to, not because I owe you, but because I want to understand the kind of man who would do what you did today." Over the following months, something unexpected happened. Clara discovered that Thomas was intelligent, well-read, and surprisingly funny in a dry, understated way. He taught her about ranching, how to ride, how to care for cattle, how to read the weather in the clouds. She taught him about literature and music, playing his late wife's piano that had sat silent for 15 years. She enrolled in college, attending classes 3 days a week, and Thomas kept his promise. He drove her to campus every Monday morning and picked her up every Wednesday evening. On the days she was at the ranch, she helped with the books, organized the household, and slowly began to make the big empty house feel like a home. Their marriage, which had begun as a business arrangement, slowly transformed into a genuine partnership. It wasn't a fairy tale romance with lightning bolts and passion. It was something deeper, something built on respect, gratitude, and a growing affection that surprised them both. A year after their wedding, Clara found Thomas in the barn one evening, checking on a mare about to foal. She stood in the doorway, watching him work, and she realized something that made her heart skip. "Thomas," she said softly. He turned, hay in his hair, a gentle smile on his face. "Yes, I love you." He froze. The smile faded, replaced by something like fear. "You don't have to say that, Clara. Our arrangement—" "There is no arrangement anymore," she interrupted, walking toward him. "There's just us, and I love you, not because you saved me, not because I'm grateful, but because of who you are. Because you wake up before dawn to check on the animals, because you listen when I talk about my classes, because you laugh at my terrible jokes, because you gave me freedom, and then made me want to stay." Thomas pulled her into his arms, and for the first time since his first wife died, since his son was killed, he allowed himself to hope, to believe that maybe, just maybe, he deserved happiness too. Clara never did become a teacher, at least not in the traditional sense. She got her degree, walked across that stage with Thomas cheering, louder than anyone, and then she came back to the ranch full-time. She and Thomas had 2 children, a boy they named James, after Thomas's son, and a girl they named Elizabeth, after Clara's mother. Clara taught them everything her mother had taught her. She also taught children from neighboring ranches, turning one of the ranch buildings into a small schoolhouse for kids who lived too far from town. The town of Millbrook never forgot that wedding day. It became a story passed down through generations, a reminder that sometimes the greatest love stories don't begin with passion, but with kindness. That true character reveals itself not in grand gestures, but in the choice to do right by another person, even when there's nothing to gain. Thomas Whitmore didn't buy a wife that day in 1952. He freed a soul, and in doing so, he found his own freedom too. The freedom to love again, to be loved in return, to build a life that honored both the past and the future. And Clara, she got everything she'd ever dreamed of, just not in the way she'd imagined. She got her education, her purpose, her family, and most surprisingly of all, she got love. Real, deep, lasting love. Sometimes the best gifts are the ones that set you free. And sometimes, when you're set free, you choose to stay.